I refuse to raise my children in a city that does not have a symphony orchestra.
The Fort Worth Symphony, after family, was the most important part of my life.
This is the story of the first eventful century of the Fort Worth Symphony Orchestra. In 1912, the original small group of amateurs needed a full year to rehearse their first concert. Early music directors C.D. Lusk and later Carl Vinth were vital figures in Fort Worth's early music scene, taking their ragtag orchestra into churches and even office buildings, developing local ears and tastes before the orchestra disbanded because of World War I. Violinist Brooks Morris, concertmaster of that first group, became the orchestra's founding father, restarting it not once but twice, in 1925 and 1957. He'd be part of the history for most of the century. In 1912, Fort Worth had barely left behind its dusty frontier past. Part of downtown was still dominated by the bars and tawdry entertainments of Hell's Half Acre.
If you think about it, it's pretty remarkable that this orchestra has a 100-year history. 1912, this community was still very young. Hell's Half Acre was still alive and kicking. And in fact, most of the musicians that formed that first symphony orchestra came from those theaters and music venues in Hell's Half Acre.
But the city was on the rise, and T&P Railroad agent and amateur flutist C.D. Lusk had long dreamed of starting an orchestra in Fort Worth. In May 1912, Lusk conducted the first concert of the Fort Worth Symphony at First Congregational Church. The 32 musicians included 3 trombone players, but only 1 violist. Mr. Lusk, the newspaper wrote, directed with his flute in hand, playing it when it was most needed. In 1913, the highly regarded violinist and composer Carl Vinth took over as music director. Under his leadership, the new Fort Worth Symphony Orchestra played up to 15 concerts per year, and the press and public seemed ready for it. An outdoor concert at Lake Como Pavilion attracted a capacity crowd of 2,000. The Star-Telegram took note of these concerts. Young businessmen and women, students, laborers enjoying their only leisure of the week, and society and club women sat elbow to elbow. But World War I loomed, and in 1917, as so many young men went off to enlist, the Fort Worth Symphony had to shut down. But its concertmaster, Brooks Morris, would not give up the dream of a permanent orchestra for Fort Worth. By 1925, Brooks Morris was ready to try again. He would be music director this time, and to get things started, he turned to his friend Leela Rogers, mother of 14-year-old aspiring dancer Ginger Rogers.
The Fort Worth Symphony Orchestra's founder is Brooks Morris. He was the concertmaster in the first performance in 1912 and then became its conductor when it was reformed in 1925. Brooks Morris was often quoted as saying he could never live in a city without a symphony orchestra.
So Leela Rogers, Ginger's mother, spoke up and said, "Brooks, why don't you start one?" I said, "Well, Leela, if you'll back me, I will." And she said, "Well, I'd be happy to." She was the society editor on the old Fort Worth Record. And she says, "I'll do everything in my power." And the others agreed. So we started from that. And it didn't take us more than a week to get started. We said, well, where will we rehearse? Where will we get the musicians? And where will we give the concerts? 3 big, momentous questions. We had no auditorium in this city. Not one, and no place to rehearse that we knew of. The only place that was used was the old First Baptist Auditorium. It was a huge place that held 4,000, didn't it, or around that. So we got on to musicians. Well, Leela said, "Brooks, you know, this town's full of little orchestras." In those days, we had an orchestra in every theater and one in almost every restaurant and hotel. And they'll surely let us have 2 or 3 players from each orchestra. And I had a personal friend who was manager of the Worth Theater, had a 30-piece orchestra. And he let us have the whole orchestra that first concert. We really knew we had it made when we got Will Rogers. And we opened that auditorium.
By the 1930s, the orchestra was established enough to move into the municipal auditorium inside the shiny new Art Deco entertainment complex named for Will Rogers. The first season there featured popular band leader Paul Whiteman, whose orchestra joined ours for a glamorous concert that ended with his friend George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. But the global catastrophes of Depression and World War II changed life in every city in America. The symphony had to cease operations for a long time, during and after the war.
I look back now and wondered that we kept going entirely through the Depression. When people were standing in bread lines, there were 2 or 3 bread lines in Fort Worth, and the musicians played without any pay at all.
In 1957, Morris thought it was finally time to once again establish a permanent orchestra in Fort Worth. But this time, after getting things started, he would remain behind the scenes. Dr. Robert Hull, Dean of TCU's School of Fine Arts, was hired as music director and conductor. The first Fort Worth Symphony concert in 14 years took place on October 29, 1957, at Will Rogers Auditorium and was received gratefully by public and press. The orchestra has continued without significant interruption ever since. A major milestone in these years was the first Van Cliburn International Piano Competition in 1962. The orchestra accompanied the young pianists in the concerto part of the competition. This immensely rewarding partnership continues today. When Robert Hull retired in 1963, Rudolph Kruger, already music director of the Fort Worth Opera, conducted the symphony for the next 2 seasons. These were still lean years for the Fort Worth Symphony. Seasons were short and concerts were sometimes canceled for lack of funds. The delightful Jack Benefit in 1966 was a high-profile event that finally helped retire a large accumulated debt. In the late 60s, the Symphony League created Oktoberfest, a colorful annual fundraiser that was beloved in Fort Worth for many years. Austin Symphony conductor Ezra Rocklin was named Fort Worth Music Director in 1965. Though concerts were still relatively few, reviews of the music making in these years were strong. The orchestra moved into the new Tarrant County Convention Center Theater in 1970, and Rocklin resigned soon after, citing artistic differences. The symphony would soon find a leader who would make bigger artistic dreams come true for Fort Worth and its orchestra. The new music director would be the most important institution builder after Brooks Morris.
I was blessed to have been called to work with an exceptionally gifted person who had the vision and the ability to convince the community to support that vision. And I'm speaking, of course, of John Giordano.
The orchestra at the time played 6 to 8 concerts a year. The budget was about $80,000. And for a community-type orchestra, it was a pretty good orchestra.
He knew that the community could not support a full-time 52-week orchestra, so he compromised. He said, okay, let's have a chamber orchestra.
The problem was not playing very much together. We didn't perform a great deal together, so my idea was to have a chamber orchestra of the highest rank.
This was a wonderfully effective model. It was also very flexible, portable, and affordable ensemble. That was our slogan. And we literally toured all over the state of Texas. I said John could have been elected the governor of Texas because he had grassroots support in almost every little city town.
In addition to an appearance at Carnegie Hall, a major achievement of Giordano's era was the chamber orchestra's historic visit to China in 1983.
The Cliburn wanted to have a competitor from China and a juror from China. And they asked me if I would go to the People's Republic of China and convince the Minister of Culture to do that. At a banquet, I proceeded to get him a little, inebriated, and he put his arm around me and said, "Why are you in China?" And I said, well, I want a competitor from Van Cliburn Piano Competition, I want a juror, and I want a tour of China for my chamber orchestra. And he said, okay, is there anything else? When we were flying to China, cultural relations again ceased and became very tense.
China and U.S. politics have tossed the Fort Worth Chamber Orchestra in the middle of confusion.
We received a telegram from Ed Bass who said, Marco Polo was brave, continue on to Beijing.
Foreign policy trouble spot for the president is China, which has canceled cultural exchanges as a result of the administration's decision to grant asylum to Chinese tennis star Hu Na.
The Fort Worth Chamber Orchestra rehearsed confidently this morning in Peking. Although they arrived 5 days ago to the tune of harsh anti-American propaganda, they have been permitted to stay on because members are here unofficially. Maestro John Giordano stayed clear of politics.
They're not listening thinking, aha, politics, they're thinking great music, and that's what we're thinking.
Many Chinese agreed. They packed the house and scrambled for programs. Were relations getting back to normal? Not quite. The other night, the orchestra performed 5 encores. Tonight, Chinese officials limited them to only 2.
Anne has red hair, and she was always surrounded wherever we went by Chinese, and she's very tall, constantly asking if they could touch her hair.
It was profoundly moving because the music moved them and it moved us, and we spoke the international language of music.
When I first came to the Fort Worth Symphony, Pop's concerts were integrated into the subscription concert series. I didn't really concur with that philosophy because it's a different audience.
When ticket sales were slow for a concert honoring the 1925 Refounding, the Star Telegram offered Giordano a deal.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you'll ride a mule across the stage, I'll give you front page coverage between now and the concert. And I said, you're on. So I had to live up to my bargain with Frank, and so I rode the white donkey on stage with Brooks Morris, the conductor in 1925, leading the donkey.
Years later, the orchestra took to the baseball field to help open the ballpark in Arlington.
Why don't we get Van Cliburn to play the national anthem for the opening, because nobody plays the national anthem like Van Cliburn. Then instead of playing an accompaniment to the second time through, he stood up and led the entire audience of I don't know how many thousands of people singing the national anthem.
The Concerts in the Garden series, beginning in the early 90s, was embraced by a broad public and quickly became one of the orchestra's signature features.
And I realized that the Fort Worth community would come hear our orchestra in the Garden series, and whatever we did, they would grow to learn that it was good, and it did not have to be a high-budgeted artist. The great tradition of the 4th of July fireworks picnic is a great community asset. It's a wonderful thing. So now, after 20-something years, we've got a great Fort Worth tradition, I believe.
As one example of Fort Worth's exceptional spirit of philanthropy, 2 generous local families stepped up with a pair of priceless gifts to the orchestra.
Back in 1981, one of our board members started an instrument acquisition program and had discovered that there were 2 Stradivarius violins that were for sale, and persuaded 2 of our local families to purchase them and loan them to the symphony.
First were Bill and Mitzi Davis.
Our concertmaster, Robert Davidovich, was a brilliant violinist, and he had been to New York, and a dealer had told him there was a Strad available. Robert played the violin. Well, of course, the Davises were just melted at the sound of, we call it a golden sound of that Strad. And so the Davises purchased it, and it's such a rare and beautiful instrument.
The Davis Strad is a beautiful violin. It has the most incredible and silvery sound that is so iconic.
Another donor did purchase the second Stradivarius. A few years later, however, she lent this violin to the Dallas Symphony after that orchestra's Stradivarius was stolen.
Well, it stayed there for then 16 years until about a year ago, it came back to the Fort Worth Symphony, to what we believe it is its rightful home. In fact, it was my first month in the position that I received an email from the owner of the 1685, And the email merely said, how would you like to have the Strad? And my answer was, well, of course.
Robust, vibrant, powerful, sweet. I think it's probably the highest honor I can get as a musician, as a violinist, to play such gorgeous instrument.
I think Bass Hall is one of the premier halls in the country. The acoustics, beautiful. I mean, our symphony is just incredibly lucky to be able to perform in a hall such as Bass Hall. And no other orchestras, in the country, I think that they envy us.
The people of Fort Worth had never heard the Fort Worth Symphony until Bass Hall was created. The acoustics in our venue were not good at all. The acoustics were so horrendous. So when Bass Hall became a reality, that alone was a significant, immediate raise in the quality of the orchestra.
The orchestra would be the hall's largest resident company with more than 60 concerts per year. Bass Hall was the perfect venue for building upon our collaborations with ballet and the Fort Worth Opera that originated decades earlier. Members of the Bass family were the prime movers behind the hall.
Ed has done so much for this city and in so many ways, so many venues, but certainly he follows the example set by his parents. Thank goodness that Nancy Lee took her children to hear the symphony and to hear the collaborative and all the other art forms in the community.
My impression of Bass Hall has not changed a bit from my first time there to my last time there. It is one of the best halls anywhere in the world.
It just seemed like there was so much love built into the hall that the hall really enhances each and every section and makes the orchestra so cohesive.
The opening of Bass Hall was one of the most thrilling experiences in my life because it is something that we all had worked on, all of us in the performing arts community.
Not long after the orchestra became established in Bass Hall, Giordano announced that he would be leaving after his 28th season.
The symphony had had a loving, committed music director for a long time in John. We'd gone a great distance. The growth had been profound. And we had the magnificent Bass Performance Hall at long last. As we were looking for a new music director, we were looking for someone that had extraordinary artistic ability, one that would be as visible as the mayor, and one that would live in Fort Worth and be completely committed to this orchestra. And, in a matter of months, Miguel had demonstrated all of the above.
The orchestra's next great music director would be Miguel Harth-Bedoya, a young Peruvian-born conductor with the talent, the energy, and the vision to lead the next chapter.
Our music director, Miguel Harth-Bedoya, has this unique combination of not only brilliant musicianship and extraordinary leadership and the ability to bring the best out of a group of musicians, but he also is just the most approachable, likable, charismatic, recognizable person in the community.
He, I think, is an extraordinary talent and has a great deal ahead of him yet to be achieved.
I think Miguel's unique qualities have had a pretty amazing impact on our ability to reach this community. It's broken down that barrier that is often between an audience and an orchestra.
I believe symphonic music should be accessible to everybody, no matter how old you are or where you come from, or whether you know a lot or a little about it. So I've implemented all kinds of ways to make any kind of barrier that may exist disappear.
Education is such a cornerstone of the Fort Worth Symphony's mission, and in fact is in our mission statement that we strive to engage young minds through the power and beauty of symphonic music. And we do that in so many ways. We reach children from kindergarten all the way through high school, and we reach 70,000 of them every year.
There were a few children's concerts in the early decades, but John Giordano and Ann Koonsman came up with a deeper approach that is the foundation of the Fort Worth Symphony's efforts today.
We procured a grant from the Junior League to hire Ann Koonsman as the director of educational activities. And Ann was superb at that. She actually trained the musicians. We actually went into the classrooms. We had the kids sit around and circle around the musicians. We allowed them to touch the instruments and to ask questions about the instruments.
The work that the orchestra does, inspiring children and their early interest in and lifelong enjoyment of music, is key to our future. It must be one of the Fort Worth Symphony's top priorities to engage young minds.
My first impression of the Fort Worth Symphony Orchestra was of the musicians themselves, was the interest in the music, the attention, the discipline, but it was the human interest that really got my attention.
He had faith in them and they rose to the occasion. For example, during the Mahler Festival, all of the critics, especially the Dallas critics, were just raving about this new orchestra in Fort Worth and what an achievement has occurred.
We have a group of the most brilliant musicians in this country, graduating from the most esteemed conservatories such as Juilliard and Curtis and the New England Conservatory of Music. And what also may be interesting is that they come from, I believe, 17 countries and 5 different continents. So it's also a very international orchestra.
During my tenure as music director, I've had the privilege and the fortune of hiring amazing musicians to join us. I was very impressed that we were able to attract top-level musicians.
We are proud to be part of this fine orchestra. We take pride in our work.
I do, as Sean mentioned, take pride in the fact that we are the Fort Worth Symphony.
When I started as music director of the Fort Worth Symphony Orchestra, I inherited a group of just under 40 full-time musicians, but of excellent quality, and this is due to the great job of my predecessor, John Giordano.
In January of 2008, in recognition of its remarkable climb up the ranks of American orchestras, the Fort Worth Symphony was invited to play back-to-back concerts at New York's Carnegie Hall.
And the orchestra played at its best. I remember that very, very clearly, with great passion, with great expression. I mean, we gave everything then, and we got a very clear reaction from the audience.
The Saturday night concert was a glittering affair. A sellout crowd heard a stirring performance of Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony and the world premiere of Osvaldo Golijov's Mariel for cello and orchestra.
So, you know, we knock 'em dead with Tchaikovsky on Saturday night. But then the next day we had the children's concert and we had John Lithgow narrate.
We love our audience, and I think that our audience showed their love for us that day by coming to New York in big numbers and in supporting the symphony. And I thought that it was just an incredible, successful event all around.
Fortunately, we had complete support of Mercedes Bass, who was able to open many doors for us and ease the way to New York.
And of course, it was very nice to get a very good review at the New York Times. Yeah, that'll never go away from me.
In this centennial season, it's natural to wonder about the Fort Worth Symphony's next 100 years.
Every great city must have a great orchestra, and this city has embraced its great orchestra and recognizes what a centerpiece of the community it has become.
I've always loved the city of Fort Worth.
Fort Worth is our home. Our children have been born here. We love raising them here.
A symphony orchestra has to be part of the fabric of a community.
You know, sometimes people tell me, and you hear the skeptics in the country that say symphony orchestras are becoming a thing of the past, that our audiences are shrinking and that someday they may just go away altogether. But I feel completely optimistic about the future of not only symphony orchestras, but of the Fort Worth Symphony. I went recently to a performance of the Fort Worth Symphony of Stravinsky's Firebird. 3 nights in a row, the audience chamber was packed. The audience was every age imaginable, from young children to the very oldest, and everyone in between. And that gives me hope.
The future of the Fort Worth Symphony Orchestra is bright. because it's about how we play music, how we deliver music, and what services do we provide to our community.
And so to be at the helm of this orchestra and in a city that I hold so dear to my heart, it really feels really like a calling. And I consider it my personal mission to make sure that this orchestra remains safe and sound and lives for the next century.
The rich history of the Fort Worth Symphony Orchestra has been written by its music directors, musicians, staff, and volunteers, but perhaps most notably by its patrons. As we take that first courageous step into the next century, the applause and generous giving spirit of the Fort Worth Symphony family will propel us into the coming era of music making.